A small town in the northwestern part of the United States lived its measured life, like many other American settlements that remained away from the fast pace of large cities. Here, everyone knew their neighbors. Every morning you could see people walking their dogs and old ladies sitting on the porches of their houses. At first glance, such a town does not seem like a place for shocking events, but in 2010, it witnessed one of the most tragic and mysterious stories that shook its residents. Margaret Hanson, a 70-year-old widow, was well known in the town. She had lived in this place most of her life and was respected by her neighbors. Her house was located on a quiet street surrounded by green gardens, with a well-kept facade and an immaculate lawn. Margaret always kept the house in order, despite her age. Her husband, William, had died of a heart attack a few years ago, and since then, Margaret had lived alone, lost in memories and leading a modest and quiet life. Neighbors often noticed her at the window or in the garden, where she was doing her favorite thing, caring for flowers. Margaret was not a person of noisy companies and preferred silence and solitude, although she maintained friendly relations with several neighbors. The Foster family lived across the street from Margaret. Tom and his wife, Linda, had moved to the city about 10 years earlier and had settled in quickly. Tom was employed at a local factory, while Linda ran the household and raised the children. Their eldest son, John Foster, had already experienced the bitterness of an unsuccessful marriage at the age of 30. After divorcing his wife, John returned to his parents' home to start life from scratch. He was a reserved and quiet young man who did not particularly like to attract attention to himself. Working at the auto repair shop helped him to escape from the problems of his personal life, and returning to his parents gave him the opportunity to start all over again, away from his ex-wife and their shared memories. John often helped his parents around the house and also helped the neighbors if they needed help. This is how his relationship with Margaret began. She would turn to him with requests for small things, to fix a plumbing problem, trim the bushes in the garden, or help with heavy furniture. For John, it was natural to help an elderly woman who always smiled at him with gratitude. Margaret, despite her apparent independence, became increasingly attached to John. Perhaps this was due to the fact that he reminded her of her own son who died in a car accident when he was young. He was her quiet salvation from loneliness, and she increasingly invited him for tea after he finished his work in her house. At first, everything seemed innocent enough. John would come to help, and Margaret would treat him to homemade baked goods and tell him stories from her youth. But gradually, their meetings became more frequent. John began to feel that Margaret's warm attitude went beyond ordinary friendship. She became increasingly interested in his life, asking about his plans for the future, his thoughts on marriage and personal relationships. John perceived this as a manifestation of concern from an elderly neighbor, but did not understand that something more was beginning to emerge in her heart. Margaret, in turn, became increasingly convinced that her relationship with John was more than just friendship. For her, he had become the one she had been waiting for all her life since her husband's death. The loneliness that had haunted her for many years seemed to finally begin to disappear. Every time John came to her house, she felt younger, more alive, as if her years did not matter. The townspeople began to notice that John was visiting Margaret too often. This caused questions and gossip among the neighbors, but no one could imagine the real scale of what was happening behind the closed doors of Margaret's house. Everything still seemed peaceful and harmless, but in reality, a connection was beginning to form between the two people that would soon develop into something tragic. Life in the town went on as usual, but for Margaret and John, things were gradually changing. Margaret began to feel more and more affection, while John, not fully aware of her feelings, continued to perceive their relationship as friendly. However, no one could have predicted that this relationship would lead to a terrible outcome that would shake the entire town. As events continue to escalate, this quiet story about neighbors will develop into a tragedy that will expose the dark side of human nature and force the townspeople to rethink how little they know about each other. Several months had passed since John had first helped Margaret with the garden, but during that time their meetings had become almost regular. It all started simply and naturally. Small jobs around the house that the elderly woman could not handle on her own. For John, this presented no difficulties. He was a quiet, calm man who liked to do things. And for Margaret, it was a kind of support that, as she believed, helped her cope with loneliness. But something in these meetings gradually changed. Margaret found herself looking forward to seeing John. These small joys, tea after work, small talk, became special moments for her, moments she lived for every day. Her house no longer seemed empty, and each visit from John filled it with the warmth and life she had missed so much since her husband died. For John, everything remained fairly mundane. He enjoyed his time with Margaret, seeing her as a caring and kind woman who treated him like a son. He had no special expectations or feelings for her. For him, she was just a grateful neighbor who needed support in difficult times. But perhaps he did not fully understand what was going on in the old woman's heart. They spent more and more time together, and for Margaret, it became something much more meaningful. She realized that her feelings for John were beginning to go beyond friendly sympathy. In her eyes, he was becoming someone special. The memory of her husband began to fade in comparison to the emotions she felt for John. He was young, strong, reliable, everything that had once been in her life, but had long since been lost. Gradually, conversations began to develop between them, becoming more and more personal. Margaret began to tell John about her life, her regrets, how lonely she was despite being surrounded by good neighbors. John listened to her attentively, but did not always understand why she shared such profound things with him. He was immersed in his thoughts related to the divorce, work, and Margaret, meanwhile, began to reveal more and more of her emotions. One day, she mentioned how hard it had been for her since her husband died. Margaret said she felt trapped in her home, as if her life had stopped. But ever since John had started coming to see her, everything had changed. She felt alive again. John smiled faintly, not giving it much thought. He thought it was just a natural reaction to loneliness. However, at that moment, it became clear to Margaret that her feelings for him went deeper than just affection. A few weeks after this frank conversation, Margaret made her first unexpected move. One evening, when John came over again to help her with the house cleaning, she invited him to stay for dinner. This did not seem unusual, given their regular meetings, but this time there was something different in the atmosphere. The dinner was prepared with special care, and Margaret looked different. She was clearly making an effort to impress. There was wine on the table, which had not previously been part of their shared dinners. John felt a little embarrassed, but he didn't show it. He sat down at the table and dinner began. The conversations again turned to everyday matters, but at some point Margaret changed the subject to more personal questions. She asked him how he felt after the divorce, how he planned to build his life in the future. John was reluctant to share his experiences, but under the influence of wine he began to open up. He talked about his failures, about how hard it was to find his place in the world again. Margaret listened attentively, but unlike John, a different picture was already forming in her thoughts. Margaret started talking about love. She told him about her relationship with her husband, about how important it was to feel needed and loved. Her words became more and more frank, and John began to feel uncomfortable. He tried to steer the conversation in a more neutral direction, but Margaret, inspired by wine and her emotions, began to talk about how life is too short to miss such moments. Something happened that evening that John did not expect at all. As dinner was ending, Margaret stood up from her chair and came over to him. She put her hand on his shoulder and, looking into his eyes, said quietly, "I need you." John was stunned. He did not know what to say and froze in a stupor. At that moment, he realized that there was no longer just friendship between them. What seemed like an innocent conversation to him turned out to be something much more serious for Margaret. This was a turning point. John felt trapped, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to hurt Margaret's feelings, but he also knew he couldn't support her feelings. There was tension in the air that would mount with each passing day, eventually leading to catastrophic consequences. After that dinner, the relationship between Margaret and John could never be the same. That evening, when she put her hand on his shoulder and said those words, the tension between them reached its peak. John was confused, unsure how to respond, and Margaret began to realize that her feelings for him had crossed a line she had not previously recognized. They both left that evening with different thoughts and experiences that could not help but affect their further communication. For John, this was a wake-up call. He knew he had to limit his contact with Margaret, but he couldn't just cut off contact. She was an older woman, and he didn't want to hurt her or leave her alone. However, after dinner, he began visiting her house less often, citing his busy schedule at the auto repair shop. He needed time to sort out his feelings and figure out how he could distance himself without hurting her. Margaret, on the other hand, perceived this distance quite differently. She began to notice that John no longer came as often as before. His visits became rare and short, and this began to worry her. She tried to find an explanation for this. Maybe he was busy, or simply did not want to help anymore. But suspicion and jealousy began to grow inside her. Her imagination painted scenes in which John devoted his attention to other women. Although there was no objective basis for this, her loneliness became oppressive again. After that dinner, when she felt especially close to John, his distance was like a knife in the heart. She began to think that she had missed the moment when she could have revealed her feelings to him. The idea arose in her head that she should take a step forward, bring John back to her, prove that she could still be attractive and needed. More and more often, Margaret called John under various pretexts. She asked him to help with fixing a doorknob, or with the plumbing, or with the garden, which she allegedly could not tidy up herself. John, still feeling a sense of duty to his elderly neighbor, came, but each time he found a reason to leave as quickly as possible. He sensed that there was an awkwardness between them, and he could not shake the feeling that Margaret wanted something more than just his help around the house. But Margaret didn't give up. She kept inviting him, arranging small dinners and trying to bring back those moments that she thought could rekindle their connection. She began to show her care for John more clearly. When he came over, she cooked his favorite dishes, always tried to look well-groomed, and sometimes even wore dresses she hadn't worn for years. Margaret believed that she could win his attention and bring back those moments that made her happy. John felt increasingly cornered. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to refuse her requests, but each visit to Margaret left him with a growing sense of guilt and awkwardness. He knew the situation was getting out of control, but he didn't know how to properly end their communication without offending her. After all, she was an old woman, and he didn't want to hurt her. One day, when John came to dinner again, Margaret decided to go even further. This time she prepared a more romantic atmosphere. There were candles on the table, and she herself wore an evening dress. John immediately felt that this dinner would be different from the previous ones. He tried not to attach importance to what was happening, but with each passing minute it became more and more obvious that Margaret was ready to take the next step. During dinner, she began to talk frankly about her feelings. She admitted that John had become more than just a neighbor or a friend to her. She felt that with his arrival in her life, she began to breathe deeply again. "You made me feel needed," she said, looking into his eyes. "I don't want to lose that feeling." John was stunned. He didn't know what to say, how to react to her frank words. He tried to explain that their relationship could not go beyond friendship, but Margaret was already immersed in her feelings. She did not listen to his explanations and continued to insist that they could be together despite their age. "Age is just a number," she repeated. John tried to end the conversation on that note and was about to leave, but Margaret stopped him. She came closer and tried to hug him. John gently pushed her away, explaining that it was wrong. At that moment, Margaret realized that her feelings for him were not mutual. He could not reciprocate what she felt for him, and this was a real blow to her. After that evening, everything changed. Margaret felt rejected. John, in turn, decided that he would no longer visit her. He knew that their communication had reached a dead end, and his continued presence would only make things worse. He needed to somehow explain to Margaret that their relationship could not continue in the way she imagined. But for Margaret, this was the end of her dreams. She no longer saw John as the one who could save her from loneliness. Now he was the one who rejected her, who could not share her feelings. Pain and jealousy began to grow in her heart, which would grow stronger with each passing day, gradually turning into a dangerous obsession. After that fateful dinner, when John rejected Margaret's attempt to move their relationship to a more intimate level, the atmosphere between them changed dramatically. John tried to avoid her, realizing that continuing to communicate would only make the situation worse. He stopped coming to any, even the most innocent, requests for help. Now, every day was filled with tension. He had to avoid clashes with Margaret not only in the yard, but also in communication with her family, who did not suspect anything about what was happening. For Margaret, this rejection was the beginning of the end of her dream. She realized that John did not return her feelings, and this was a heavy blow for her. She began to immerse herself more and more in her thoughts, tormented by questions about why he did not choose her. Maybe I'm old. Maybe I'm not as beautiful as I used to be, she thought on long, lonely evenings, sitting in her empty house. But the despair and pain were gradually replaced by determination. She couldn't just let John go. The idea was growing in her head that she had to get his attention by any means necessary. A dangerous obsession was growing inside her. She couldn't allow herself to be alone with her fears and loneliness. In her imagination, he was still the one who could bring her happiness and meaning back to life. Margaret began to act more persistently. At first, she tried to call him again under various pretexts, but John remained adamant. Then she decided to approach him from a different angle. Her strategy became surveillance. She spent more and more time at the window, watching his house, trying to figure out where he was and with whom. She wanted to find out if there was someone else in his life who could lay claim to his attention. This secret surveillance became a real obsession for Margaret. She stopped doing her usual things. Her interests narrowed down to one goal: to bring John back into her life. She began to appear in places where she had never been before, in order to accidentally cross paths with him. Sometimes these were visits to a store that was located near his work, and sometimes she simply walked down the street, hoping to meet him by chance. These meetings did not look suspicious to others, but John noticed her presence more and more often. He began to feel uneasy, realizing that her persistence was increasing. He tried to avoid any contact, limiting his walks and trying to get home quickly without being seen by her. But Margaret was determined. She was not going to back down. One day, John ran into Margaret again by chance at a local store. She approached him with a good-natured smile, as if nothing had happened. "John, I just wanted to see you," she began. "You've been missing for a while, and I'm worried. Are you okay?" John tried to calmly reply that he had a lot of work and didn't have time to get out of the house often, but Margaret didn't back down. "I understand that you have a lot to do," she continued, "but I feel like you're avoiding me. Weren't we good friends?" Her words were full of reproach, but John tried not to succumb to the provocation. He apologized, saying that he was simply busy and promised to drop in to see her. But both of them understood that these were just empty words. After this encounter, Margaret realized that her previous methods were no longer working. She needed to act more decisively. Soon, she began actively seeking out moments to meet where she could get close to John again. She hoped that if he saw her again in those intimate moments, their connection would be rekindled and he would change his mind. One evening, when John was returning from work, he found Margaret waiting for him again at the gate of his house. It was unexpected, and he felt a tension inside. She approached him, and smiling, offered to talk. "I just wanted to apologize again for the other night," she said, alluding to their last dinner. John, sensing that the conversation could develop into something more, tried to avoid the discussion, but Margaret insisted. "Please don't leave me alone. I was stupid to ruin everything." Her voice was filled with despair. John tried to gently explain that their relationship could not be what she wanted it to be, but Margaret continued to insist on meetings. She suggested that he come to dinner again, just as friends, so that everything would be back to normal. John knew the situation was getting out of control. He saw not only regret in her eyes, but also something more dangerous, an obsession that grew with each passing day. He knew that each new meeting would only make things worse, but he could not rudely push her away. His kindness and sense of duty to the older woman did not allow him to break this connection completely. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to plan. Her mind was filled with the idea that John should be with her. She stopped realizing and seeing the consequences of her actions. Now every day was devoted to thoughts about how to bring him back into her life. These secret meetings and attempts at rapprochement became more and more intrusive. John felt the pressure, but he didn't yet understand how serious it was. Margaret couldn't stop. She was sure that all they needed was another chance, another opportunity to be together. No one in town knew what was going on between them. To their neighbors, they were the same as before. An elderly woman who was helped around the house by a young man. But inside this silence and calm, a tragedy was unfolding that would soon spill out. Several weeks had passed since Margaret had begun actively seeking out John again. Their interactions, which had previously seemed innocent and friendly, had now become complex and tense. John felt increasingly cornered. He tried to avoid Margaret, but she always found ways to be there, no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from her. For Margaret, every rejection or avoidance from John only fueled her resolve. She began to behave more persistently, almost openly obsessing over him. John, feeling the growing tension, began to go out less and less, trying to spend more time outside the house to minimize the possibility of meeting Margaret. He felt that her behavior had become not just intrusive, but also disturbing. She was showing up too often where she shouldn't be, at the auto repair shop, near his house, in the stores where he went shopping. John increasingly felt her presence on him, as if he was being watched. But the most disturbing thing was that Margaret no longer tried to hide her feelings. She could appear at his house at any time of the day or night. One day, when he was returning late from work, he saw her standing at the gate of his house. It was an unusual moment, full of discomfort, and John tried to quickly pass by, but Margaret called out to him. "John," she said, her voice filled with despair, "why are you avoiding me? What did I do wrong?" He paused for a moment, trying to find the right words to explain to her that their relationship couldn't be what she imagined. He didn't want to hurt her, but he knew that continuing to communicate would only make things worse. "You haven't done anything, Margaret," he began, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I just need some time to myself right now. I have a lot of work to do, and I'm trying to figure out my life." But her eyes were full of misunderstanding and sadness. She took a step forward and tried to touch his hand, but John instinctively stepped back, feeling that the situation was getting out of control. "I just want things to be like before," she said quietly, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "We were so close. You were the only one who made me feel alive. Can't you see that we can be happy together?" Her words sounded like a cry from the heart, but John couldn't give her what she wanted. He understood that this was no longer just friendship, but a dangerous emotional dependence. "Margaret," he said softly but firmly, "this can't go on. I can't give you what you're looking for. We have to stop this communication. It won't be right for either of us." Margaret stood still, her eyes cold. She couldn't believe he was saying such things. She couldn't believe that John was willing to just break off their relationship. Her heart sank with pain and anger. In that moment, she realized that he would never share her feelings. As John turned and walked toward his house, leaving her standing there, Margaret realized that her fears were becoming reality. She was afraid of losing him, and now that fear was beginning to grow into despair. With every step John took, she felt her last hope for happiness slipping away. But along with the despair, anger began to grow. Anger at John for rejecting her, at life for leaving her alone, at the world for never giving her what she so desperately wanted. Several days passed, and Margaret made no attempt to contact John. She withdrew into herself, lost in her thoughts. She stopped leaving the house, closed herself off from the outside world, as if hiding from her own feelings. But inside her, a plan was brewing. Her obsession with John had already reached a dangerous stage. Now she no longer simply dreamed of being with him. She decided that if she could not have him, she would rather destroy everything that connected them. John, feeling that Margaret was no longer pursuing him, relaxed a little. He thought that maybe their conversation had helped, and Margaret had finally understood him. But he had no idea what was really going on in her head. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to hatch her plan. She knew she couldn't just let him go. Her emotions had clouded her judgment, and now she was ready to go to extremes to preserve at least the illusion that she and John still had a future. She could no longer bear the thought of him rejecting her. Now she saw only one path before her. If he couldn't be with her, he wouldn't be with anyone. These thoughts did not leave her day or night. She plunged into dark fantasies about how to put an end to their painful relationship. Margaret could no longer distinguish reality from her dreams and fears. Images of how she could take John for herself, forever, swarmed in her head. And this thought became more and more frightening and powerful, preparing to come true. Several weeks had passed since John had last seen Margaret outside his home. The whole situation with her obsessive attention seemed like a distant memory to him, and he hoped that everything had gotten better. Life went on as usual. Work at the auto repair shop took up most of his time, and he tried to stay away from any meetings with Margaret. He believed that their last conversation had helped her understand her boundaries, and he did not expect such persistent steps from her anymore. But for Margaret, these weeks were agony. The loneliness she had hidden from herself for so long was now unbearable. Her obsession with John had reached its limit, and she realized that she could no longer live without him. He was her last thread of life and meaning. The thought was growing in Margaret's mind. If he was not with her, she would destroy them both. This would be her last way to regain control over a situation that had gotten out of her hands. That night, which would be fateful for both of them, Margaret decided that she would not wait any longer. She knew that her continued loneliness would be even more painful, and she made a decision that would change their lives forever. She cooked dinner as before, hoping that John would come, but of course he did not appear. She drank several glasses of wine, trying to calm her nerves, but instead her anger and despair only increased. Images of their last conversation, his coldness and refusal, swirled in her head. It became unbearable for her. Deciding it was time to act, Margaret took the key to his house that John had once given her in case of an emergency. That gesture of trust now seemed ironic to her. He had given her access to his home, and now it would be the beginning of the end. Margaret grabbed a kitchen knife, clutched it tightly in her hand, and feeling a surge of adrenaline, headed for John's house. She entered his house late at night when the city had already fallen silent. Everything inside was just as she remembered. She saw him sitting at the table, lost in thought. Her heart was pounding and her hands were shaking. At that moment, John didn't even suspect what was happening. He turned around when he heard footsteps and was stunned to see Margaret holding a knife. "What are you doing here?" he asked, but there was fear in his voice as well as surprise. Margaret didn't answer. There was something in her eyes that made John rise from his chair and take a step back. She came closer to him, the knife in her hand glinting in the lamplight, and John knew this was serious. "You can't ignore me anymore, John," she said quietly but firmly. "I can't live like this anymore. You're my only chance at happiness." "Margaret, calm down," he began, trying to speak softly, hoping that she would be able to come to her senses. "We can talk. I don't want anyone to get hurt." But Margaret had already crossed the line beyond which there was no turning back. She had lived with pain and despair for too long, and now her mind was clouded with thoughts that it was all over. "You don't understand, John," she said, clutching the knife even tighter. "If I can't be with you, no one can. You left me no choice." John tried to back away, but Margaret quickly closed in on him. It all happened so fast that he had no time to process it. In the chaos and panic, she had stabbed him first, and that was the beginning of the end. It was as if everything was happening in slow motion. There was only despair and pain in Margaret's eyes, and her every move was dictated by hopelessness. John tried to pull away, but the knife wound quickly weakened him. He fell to the floor, and Margaret, as if not fully aware of what she had done, looked at his body with a devastated expression. Now that it had happened, she realized that nothing mattered anymore. Silence filled the room. There was no victory or joy in her heart, only a deep, painful sense of loss. She realized that it was all over, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Margaret sat down on the floor next to John, her eyes fixed on one spot, as if she couldn't believe what she had done. Her dreams of love and happiness had been shattered in that very moment. Now she was all alone, and John, the one she had wanted to hold on to, would never be there again. It was a fateful moment that would forever change the lives of everyone who knew them. What began as a passionate but one-sided affair would end in a bloody finale that would shock the entire city. Several days had passed since that fateful evening when Margaret killed John. The town went on with its normal life, unaware of the terrible tragedy that had unfolded behind closed doors. There was no sign of trouble, but John's absence could not go unnoticed for long. His parents, Tom and Linda, began to worry when he did not return home or answer their phones for several days in a row. At first, they assumed that he might have gone away on business or been delayed at work, but as time went on, their anxiety grew. On the third day after his disappearance, his parents decided to call the police. Linda, scared and shaking, held the phone in her hands, dialing the local police station. They had never experienced anything like this before. John had always been responsible and never disappeared without warning. For his parents, his disappearance came as an unexpected blow, especially since he had tried to lead a more stable life after the divorce. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her house, locked away from the world. She didn't go out, didn't talk to her neighbors, didn't answer her phone. Conflicting emotions raged inside her. On the one hand, she realized the gravity of her actions, but on the other, her mind refused to accept reality. John's murder had become a point of no return for her, and now she was completely immersed in her thoughts, trying to find a way to cover up the traces of her crime. She didn't remove the body right away. For hours after John was dead, she just sat next to him, unable to move. Her mind was clouded by a mixture of fear, despair, and a strange feeling of emptiness inside. She couldn't believe that this had actually happened, that her actions had led to such a tragedy. Once the initial shock wore off, Margaret realized that she had to get rid of the body so that no one would know what she had done. She knew that if anyone found John in her house, it would be the end for her. Overwhelmed by the fear of being discovered, she made the decision to hide his body. As darkness fell, Margaret, shaking with nervous tension, dragged John's body into the basement of her house. It was a hard and terrible task, but she acted automatically, as if her mind had switched off. Each step was difficult, her hands shaking with fear and fatigue. The basement was dark, cold, and every corner of it reminded Margaret of her mad act. There she hid the body, wrapping it in a sheet. This temporary solution seemed to her the only way out. The whole town began to worry about John's disappearance. His co-workers noticed that he had stopped showing up for work, and his friends who called him couldn't get an answer. Linda and Tom, exhausted by the uncertainty, began asking their neighbors if anyone had seen their son. The answers were the same. No one had seen John for several days. The anxiety grew, and soon rumors began to spread throughout the town. The police began their investigation by inspecting John's usual haunts. His home, workshop, and favorite places to relax were thoroughly checked, but no trace of him was found. The officers assigned to the case knew John as a calm and non-confrontational person, so his sudden disappearance aroused doubts and suspicions among everyone. The entire city began to wonder what could have happened to him. One morning, the police came to Margaret's house. They knocked on her door, and Margaret froze. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she thought she could hear it. She knew this moment would come, but she was not prepared for it to happen so quickly. The police asked her if she had seen John in the last few days. Margaret, gathering all her willpower, answered that she had not seen him for a long time and knew nothing about his disappearance. Her voice was trembling, but the police, not noticing anything suspicious, left, continuing their search in other places. But this encounter with the police awakened even more fear in Margaret. It became clear to her that she would not be able to hide the truth for long. She began to get nervous, panic, trying not to give herself away to her neighbors. But her inner tension became unbearable. She understood that every day could expose her. Meanwhile, John's parents began to realize that his disappearance was not just an accident or a temporary departure. Tom, who had been more optimistic, began to realize that something had gone terribly wrong. Linda was in constant hysterics, unsure of what to do. The police were working to find him, but they had no leads. It was as if John had vanished without a trace. As the days passed, rumors began to circulate. Some speculated that John might have left without warning, while others began to suspect that something far more sinister was behind his disappearance. But no one, not even his parents, could imagine that John had been murdered by Margaret, an elderly woman who everyone knew as a kind and friendly neighbor. Investigators continued to work, looking at all possible places where John could have been. One of the key points in the investigation was that the last person to see him alive was, according to eyewitnesses, his neighbor, Margaret. This discovery aroused the investigators' suspicions, and they soon returned to her house again. Margaret began to realize that her time of peace was coming to an end. She did not know what to do next, and the fear that her crime would soon be revealed filled her mind. She could no longer live in constant tension, but she also did not have the courage to confess to what she had done. All she could do was wait. wait for the moment when the truth would come out and her life would finally fall apart. John's disappearance, which had already attracted the attention of not only his parents but the entire community, soon attracted serious attention from the police. The usual searches were not yielding any results, and this became a serious cause for concern. About a week after his disappearance, the investigation entered a more active phase. The police had no concrete evidence or witnesses, but one fact began to emerge again and again. The last person John was seen with was his neighbor, an elderly widow named Margaret. The police decided to return to this fact, realizing that they had missed an important detail. At first, suspicion did not fall on Margaret, because her age and status as a respectable resident of the town did not fit the image of a suspect. However, during conversations with neighbors, they learned that John often visited her house, helping her with the housework. And although this in itself seemed normal, they were worried by the fact that after John's disappearance, no one saw her on the street anymore. The police decided to conduct a more thorough search of Margaret's home. They came with a search warrant, and this time she couldn't avoid contact with law enforcement. When the police knocked on her door, Margaret opened it with a cold, grim determination. Her face was pale and her eyes were full of worry, although she tried to appear calm. Inside her, a storm was raging. She knew this day would come, and she could no longer find a way to escape the inevitable. As investigators entered her home, Margaret tried to remain calm, but her nervousness was obvious. She could barely hide the trembling in her hands. The police began to carefully examine each room, but for the first few minutes, nothing suspicious was found. Margaret sat on a chair in the living room, trying not to meet their eyes. Her heart was pounding, and she felt like the end was coming. The investigators walked down the hallway, looked into the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom, finding nothing suspicious. But they knew there was more to the house than met the eye. One of them suggested they look in the basement. Margaret froze, her heart literally stopping for a moment. The basement was where she had hidden John's body, wrapped in an old sheet. As the police officers headed toward the basement, Margaret felt her hands grow cold. She knew the end was near. The silence in the house became unbearable. All she could do was sit and wait. Time slowed as the investigator opened the basement door and slowly walked down. The basement was dark and damp, the air musty, as if the place had not been used for a long time. The investigators turned on their flashlights and began to examine the premises. One of them noticed a strange smell that gradually grew stronger as they moved deeper into the basement. It was something putrid, uncharacteristic of an old house. They stopped at a corner of the basement, where among dusty boxes and old furniture, there was a bundle of sheets. One of the police officers cautiously approached, his instincts telling him that they had stumbled upon something important. When he unfolded the sheet, the sight that greeted him shocked everyone present. John's body, already partially decomposed, lay there, rolled up and hidden away like an unwanted object. The smell was terrible, but that wasn't what shocked the investigators. The fact that an elderly woman, considered decent and kind, was hiding the corpse of a young man in her basement was unimaginable. The policemen knew immediately that this was no mere tragic accident. This was murder, and they were now faced with a serious crime. One of them immediately went upstairs to report the discovery of the body. When they returned to the living room where Margaret sat, her face was pale and emotionless. She knew that her secret was out. The investigator, trying to speak calmly, asked her a direct question. "Margaret, can you explain how John's body ended up in your basement?" Her lips trembled, but she did not speak. Margaret realized that all her attempts to hide the truth had failed, and she no longer had the strength to fight. She simply sat, as if tired of life itself, and did not resist when her hands were shackled into handcuffs. The police immediately arrested her, but the shock of what they learned overshadowed everything. Everyone in town knew Margaret as a sweet old woman who often sat on her porch and tended her garden. No one could have imagined that she could do something like this. The news that John's body had been found in Margaret's house spread like wildfire around town. Neighbors were shocked. People couldn't believe that someone they knew was involved in such a horrible crime. John's parents were devastated. They couldn't comprehend that their son was dead and that the woman they trusted was behind his death. The investigation continued, but the basic picture was clear. Margaret had killed John in a fit of jealousy and madness. It was an irreversible decision, driven by years of loneliness and deep emotional crisis. Her obsession with him had led to catastrophic consequences, and now the city that had seemed so calm and measured was shaken to its very foundations. Margaret, sitting in her cell, no longer felt anything. She understood that everything she had tried to create, her dreams of love and salvation from loneliness, had collapsed the moment she picked up the knife. Her life was now nothing more than an empty shell, full of regrets and pain. And the city continued to live on, with a heavy stain of this tragedy on its face. After John's body was found in Margaret's basement, the town was plunged into an atmosphere of horror and shock. The police immediately began a full-fledged investigation into the case. Although at first glance everything seemed obvious, the body was found in Margaret's house, and she did not deny her involvement. Investigators needed to reconstruct the entire chain of events to understand what led to this tragic outcome. The case took on not only a criminal, but also a psychological character, since it was difficult for everyone to understand what exactly pushed the elderly woman to commit murder. Margaret was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. Her condition shocked everyone. She looked broken. Her eyes were empty. Her face was pale, as if life had left her long before that day. The investigators knew that her mental state could play a key role in what happened, but none of them were prepared for what she would reveal during the interrogation. From the start, Margaret offered no resistance or denial. She walked into the interrogation room silently, her hands shaking and her gaze fixed on one spot. The officers sat down across from her and began asking questions. They expected to hear the standard explanations, perhaps an argument, a violent outburst, or something similar. But what they heard was far more frightening. Margaret began her story by describing how lonely she had been in the years since her husband's death. Her life, she said, had lost all meaning, and each day had become just a repetition of the same routine. She spoke slowly, as if in some kind of trance. Every word she spoke was saturated with deep sadness. Her loneliness was the backdrop against which this tragedy unfolded. "John was more than just a neighbor to me," she began, her voice shaking. "He was my salvation. He made me feel alive. I knew our relationship couldn't be what I thought it would be, but I couldn't accept that." Investigators recorded her words, but each new fact she told revealed darker sides of her mind. She described how her obsession with John grew with each visit, how she became more attached to him, hoping that he could fill the void she carried within her. But when John began to avoid her, when he refused her advances, her reality began to crumble. "I couldn't let him go," Margaret continued. "He was all I had left. When he rejected me, I felt like nothing made sense anymore." She went on to describe the fateful evening when she walked into his house with a knife in her hand. Her voice grew quieter as she described how she had made the decision to kill him. "It wasn't anger. It was desperation," she said quietly. "If I couldn't be with him, I couldn't let anyone else be with him." These words shocked the investigators. The murder was not a flash of rage, but an act of despair and hopelessness. Margaret was not an ordinary killer. Her actions were the result of a long and painful internal crisis that led her to mental collapse. Investigators understood that there was much more behind this crime than just jealousy or conflict. But despite her confession, police had to gather all the evidence and details they could to build a complete picture. Investigators re-examined her home and basement, trying to figure out how long John's body had been there, what events led up to his murder, and what happened that fateful evening. They also looked at Margaret's behavior in recent months, her interactions with neighbors, her strange habits that might indicate her deteriorating mental state. The investigation learned that Margaret had become increasingly withdrawn and distant in the weeks leading up to the murder. She stopped leaving her house and avoided socializing with neighbors and friends. At the same time, people began to notice that John was visiting her less often and that their once friendly interactions had become strained. Some neighbors who were interviewed by the police recalled seeing Margaret at her window looking out at John's house, which seemed strange to them, but no one paid any attention to it at the time. In addition, investigators found old letters written by Margaret, which she apparently never sent. In these letters, she expressed her feelings for John, talked about her longing and loneliness. These letters revealed another side of her psyche. She was deeply mistaken in her expectations and hopes, and this only strengthened her obsession. The evidence collected, Margaret's confession, and witness statements paint a picture of a tragedy that unfolded over months, if not years. Margaret's psychological instability and inability to cope with her emotions became the catalyst for this horrific crime. The police realized that the case was much more complex than it seemed at first glance. John's murder was the result of a deep emotional wound that was not noticed by those around her. A quiet and respectable elderly woman found herself locked in a world of her own fantasies and fears, which led her to take a fatal step. For John's parents, it was unbearable. They could not understand how this could have happened. Their son, whom they loved and considered a good man, had become the victim of a tragic and inexplicable crime. For them, the loss was not only personal, but also painful because his life had been cruelly cut short by someone they trusted. The investigation had come to an end, and now Margaret's case was about to go to trial. The town was still reeling from the shock, and rumors and gossip about what had happened continued to multiply. The townspeople still couldn't believe that one of the most respected members of their community had been involved in such a horrific crime. The investigators only had to hand the case over to the court, but one thing was clear to everyone. This story would remain in the city's memory for a long time, as a reminder of how hidden emotions can lead to the most tragic consequences. Margaret's trial was the most high-profile event in the city in many years. What began as a routine investigation into John's disappearance turned into a tragedy that shook the entire community. News of her arrest and confession to the murder quickly spread throughout the city and its surrounding areas, attracting the attention of not only local media, but journalists from other regions as well. The trial promised to be more than just a formality, but a real drama, with an elderly woman who was once considered one of the most respected residents of the city at the center. Margaret, 70, appeared before the court in a state of deep emotional collapse. She no longer tried to hide her feelings or defend herself. Her lawyers advised her to plead guilty, hoping for leniency from the court, given her age and possible mental disorder. But even with such advice, Margaret could not say much in her defense. She knew that everything that had happened was the result of her own actions, and she understood that there was no excuse for it. On the day the trial began, the courtroom was packed. People wanted to see with their own eyes the woman who had committed such a terrible crime. Journalists and city residents filled the halls and corridors of the courthouse. Local TV channels covered the event, and every new fact that became known during the hearings was spread throughout the city. At the first hearing, Margaret was calm but dejected. She looked to have aged several years since her arrest. Her face was deeply tired, and there was a void in her eyes. She knew that her life was practically over, that everything she had ever considered important was lost forever. Now all she had to do was face the consequences of her actions. The prosecution presented a detailed picture of what happened on the day of the murder. The prosecutor, using Margaret's confession and the evidence they had collected, recreated the scenes of her last meeting with John, when she entered his house and fatally stabbed him. Throughout the trial, the prosecutor emphasized that this was not a random crime. It was the result of a carefully nurtured obsession that led to a tragic end. Margaret's lawyers tried to portray her as a victim of her mental state, focusing on her age, loneliness, and the depression that had ravaged her mind for years. They argued that her actions were not the result of cold-blooded calculation, but were the result of an emotional breakdown that could be explained by her mental illness. But despite these arguments, most people, including the judges, were skeptical. When it came time to question the witnesses, many of John's neighbors and friends were called to testify. His parents, Tom and Linda, gave emotional testimony, talking about their son, his kindness and willingness to help people, especially Margaret. Linda, unable to hold back tears, described how John often went to Margaret's home to help her, and how they never thought it would lead to such a tragedy. Her voice trembled as she said, "We trusted her. We never imagined she would do something like this." The testimony left a deep impression on everyone present. John's parents became a symbol of the grief and suffering that had befallen the family. They had lost more than just a son. They had lost faith in those they had considered friends and neighbors. In turn, Margaret's lawyers tried to portray her as an unhappy woman who could not cope with her inner demons. But the prosecutor, aware of the public mood, emphasized that John was the victim of betrayal by someone he trusted. In his closing argument, the prosecutor said, "This city knew Margaret as an honorable woman, But behind the closed doors of her home lurked a dark secret, obsession and jealousy that led to murder. Letters Margaret wrote to John but never sent were discussed during the trial. These letters were found by police in her home and painted her in an even more disturbing light. In them, she described her deep feelings for John, her fear of losing him, and how she perceived his attentions as more than just friendship. This intertwining of reality and her fantasy became a key argument for the prosecutor, who argued that the murder was a premeditated act, a last-ditch attempt to maintain control over the man who had rejected her. When it came time for sentencing, the entire courtroom was in suspense. Margaret stood before the judge, expressionless, but her face betrayed the full realization that her life had been destroyed. The judge, having heard all sides, pronounced the verdict, finding Margaret guilty of premeditated murder. Her sentence was harsh: life imprisonment without parole. The judge explained his decision by saying that despite her age, the gravity of the crime and its premeditation did not allow for leniency. He also emphasized that Margaret's actions were deliberate and premeditated, and that she posed a danger to society. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in emotion. John's parents hugged, unable to hold back their tears, finally feeling some sense of justice. Journalists began recording their reports quickly, and the city began talking about what had happened again. Margaret stood motionless, unmoving by the verdict. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. Her life seemed to have ended the day she committed murder. Now, all that awaited her was long years of solitude within the prison walls, with plenty of time to rethink every moment that had led her to this outcome. The townspeople who lived through this tragedy spent a long time discussing the trial and how such a quiet and calm woman could commit such a brutal crime. For them, it was a lesson in how little they can know about the people living next to them, and how hidden feelings and emotions can grow into something destructive. Margaret, who once lived a quiet and peaceful life, has now become infamous, and her name will remain in the memory of this city as a reminder of the terrible tragedy that occurred in the midst of their ordinary everyday life. Years passed since the tragedy, and the town began to come back to life. The new residents who moved here knew nothing of the events that took place in Margaret and John's house. Adults tried not to talk about it, and children who grew up in this town only heard snippets of stories that were whispered or slipped into conversations. But for those who lived here during these events, it was more than just history. It was a wound that still hurt, although it no longer bled. Neighbors who witnessed the tragedy still remembered how the city had been shaken by the crime. But as often happens with tragedies, time gradually erased the sharp edges of memories. People began to talk about other events, and little by little the story of John and Margaret faded into the shadows. John's house stood empty for a long time until it was finally bought by a new family. They knew nothing of what had happened within those walls, and this allowed the street to come alive. The new family brought warmth and comfort to the house. The laughter of children filled the rooms where there had once been only silence and stillness. It symbolized the beginning of a new cycle of life, in which there was no room for the nightmares of the past. For the neighbors, it was a sign that even the darkest events can be left behind, and life can go on even when it seems that everything is destroyed. But those who knew John personally will never be able to forget him completely. For them, his memory was linked not only to the tragedy, but also to the kind, helpful, and generous man he was. These qualities were always remembered fondly. Some of his friends continued to gather to honor his memory, remembering not his death, but his life, the light he brought to their circle. These gatherings became a tradition that helped keep his spirit alive among those who loved him. Margaret's death, while it brought legal closure, did not bring complete closure for many. Her death in prison was the final point in her life, but for society it was more a symbol of a completed tragedy than atonement. Some were still trying to understand what exactly had driven her to this madness. Psychologists and experts debated her mental state, with many believing that loneliness played a key role in her obsession. Others believed that there was something dark about her from the start, hidden behind the veil of friendliness and respect she inspired in her neighbors. Among these theories and discussions, one thing was clear. None of the explanations would bring John back or fix what had been destroyed. Nevertheless, the city, like all places that have experienced tragedies, continued to live. Little by little, Traces of the past were erased. Houses were rebuilt, people moved. New generations began to walk the streets that had once been the place where the drama unfolded. Young people who learned about the events only from rumors often did not even know all the details, and those who did no longer wanted to talk about it. The past remained the past. John's parents, Tom and Linda, never returned to the city. Their lives after the move continued to be full of pain and grief, but they tried to build a new reality. Time healed the wounds, but the pain of losing their son never completely went away. They lived each day, keeping his memory in their hearts, and every year on his birthday, they lit a candle in his honor, remembering the best moments of his life. For them, life without John was like living in the shadows, but they tried to find the strength to go on. They supported each other, realizing that without each other's support, it would be even harder. With each passing year, their grief became less acute, but it never completely disappeared. They had to learn to live with this pain as part of their destiny. Meanwhile, the story of Margaret and John was gradually fading from public memory. It was spoken of less and less, and became something of an urban legend, told to new residents in bits and pieces. People preferred not to go into detail, as it brought back too many unpleasant memories. But even years later, every now and then someone passing John's or Margaret's old house might wonder how such tragedies could happen in the most unexpected places. It was a story about how human emotions could spiral out of control, how loneliness and pain could ruin a life, how love and obsession could turn into deadly weapons. This tragedy left a mark on the hearts of the people who witnessed the events. But the city, like the people, continued to live on. The story of Margaret and John remained a lesson for those who knew them personally, and a reminder for everyone else that behind ordinary faces and lives, there can be dark secrets that should never be ignored. Although the city tried to forget, this story would always remain a part of its past, like a shadow that would occasionally appear. And those who remembered John continued to keep him in their hearts, hoping that such tragedies would never happen again. A decade after the tragedy, the city had changed completely. New people, new houses, new shops. All this gave the city a fresh look. Places that were once filled with fear and mystery now looked peaceful and familiar. But the memory of the events that happened here many years ago still lived in the minds of some people, like a shadow that would never disappear completely. The story of John and Margaret has become something of a legend among the old-timers. For those who moved here recently, it was just a rumor that was passed around in whispers, almost like an urban legend that over the years grows more detailed and less real. But for those who knew them personally, it was a real tragedy that left deep scars in their hearts. John's house was now occupied by a young family after the renovation. They knew nothing of what had happened there, and perhaps it was for the best. The new residents brought joy and life that transformed the place. The garden, once neglected and overgrown with weeds, was once again blooming with colorful flowers, and the windows of the house, which had previously been covered with thick curtains, were now open, letting in sunlight. It was a symbol of a new beginning. The place where tragedy had once happened was filled with life again. Neighbors who remembered John had long avoided talking about the past, but over time they began to talk about it in a new way. They no longer spoke of the tragedy as a shocking and frightening event, but rather as a warning, an important lesson for everyone. The essence of this lesson was that even the quietest and most decent people can harbor deep and dangerous emotions if they are not recognized in time. One of John's closest friends, Michael, who was his colleague and worked with him at the auto repair shop, had long tried to understand how his friend had become the victim of such a tragic turn of events. Michael knew John as a quiet but kind-hearted man who was always ready to help. Meetings with Margaret seemed like a normal thing, a young man helping an elderly woman, which was completely natural in their small town. But when Michael learned about what really happened, it shook him to the core. Michael couldn't forgive himself for not noticing that something was wrong. He saw John every day at work, and everything seemed normal. But now, looking back, he remembered how John had become less sociable and more withdrawn. Michael hadn't asked him the questions that might have prevented the tragedy. Michael lived with this feeling of guilt for many years, but like everyone else, he learned to live with the burden. Eventually, he realized that no one can predict such events. You can't predict how someone you've known all your life will do something unthinkable. But that didn't absolve you of the responsibility to be more considerate of the people around you. That was the lesson Michael learned from the tragedy, and he tried to pass it on to others. He didn't say it outright, but he always reminded his friends and loved ones of the importance of looking out for one another, noticing changes in behavior, and not ignoring signs that someone might be in trouble. John's parents, Tom and Linda, never got over his death. Moving to another city helped them distance themselves from the memories, but they still felt the weight of their loss every day. Linda found solace in charity work. She became involved with organizations that helped families who had lost loved ones to violence. It became a way for her to process the tragedy and help others cope with the same grief her family had endured. Tom, on the other hand, retreated deeper into himself. He couldn't find a way to cope with the loss. Work and routine became his escape from thoughts of John. He and Linda rarely spoke about their son out loud, but every time she returned home from yet another charity event, Tom looked at her with a silent question in his eyes. He knew Linda was coping with it better than he was, but he couldn't find the strength in himself. When they gathered at the cemetery on the 10th anniversary of John's death, Tom and Linda both stood at his headstone, holding hands. It was a moment of silence when words were not needed. Everything had been said over the years, and now they simply looked at the cold stone with his name on it, remembering the days when he was with them. For them, the loss was an everlasting pain that they learned to live with, but could never fully accept. Life without John was incomplete, but they still found the strength to carry on for the sake of those who remained close to them. Linda, each time she saw new families she helped, remembered her son, but instead of bitterness, she now felt that his memory lived on through her actions. For the city, this story also became part of its past, but it did not disappear completely. People continued to remember it, but now with a greater degree of understanding. It was not just a tragic event, but also an important reminder of how vulnerable the human psyche can be, how loneliness can consume a person if a helping hand is not given in time. This lesson remained in the memory of those who witnessed these events. The story of Margaret and John has forever remained in the city as a reminder of how thin the line is between normal life and madness, how easy it is to miss the hidden pain and suffering of the people around us.